Thank you, Yoni, and thank you everyone who is joining us as viewers, listeners, and of course, thank you to our speakers. My name is Avital. I'm an analyst at the Re'ut Group, and I welcome everyone for our breakout session number 4, Engaging Liberal and Progressive Circles During the Conflict. I'm your moderator. During the session, each speaker will have 6 minutes only to present their best ideas and practices on how to address the issue of engaging liberal and progressive circles during the conflict and how it can help deal with the phenomena of Israel and Jewish erasure in the progressive discourse. After that, we will have, hopefully, few minutes for Q&A. You can see the special Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and you're more than welcome to share your questions, ideas, comments. All the sessions are recorded and will be posted on reutgroup.org website, so you will be able to access all the discussions on your own free time. As I mentioned, any comments you may have or thoughts during the session, write it down in the Q&A box, or actually also in the chat box. If we don't have any time to refer to your questions, all this input will be gathered and compiled into the seminar summary, and we will follow up at a later stage. At the end of the session, you can return to the lobby and enter the final panel, or the panel after us. It won't be the final one. So now moving on to meet our speakers. Kenneth S. Stern, Ken, is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and author of The Conflict Over the Conflict, which chronicles one of the most divisive and toxic issues on today's college and university campuses, Israel and Palestine. Nomi Colton-Max, a proud progressive Zionist, Nomi is currently the chair of the executive board and vice president of Ameinu. Nomi also serves on the World Zionist Organization Expanded Executive and is involved with Brit Etz, the World Zionist Union of the Labor Movement. Jonathan Kessler, founder and CEO of Heart of a Nation. Jonathan has devoted his professional life to assembling thought leaders and strengthening intercommunal alliances. For 18 years, Jonathan was a member of AIPAC senior staff, having previously served as executive director of the Center for Middle East Peace and president of a consulting firm specializing in Middle East public diplomacy. Rabbi David Saperstein. Rabbi Saperstein directed the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, representing the Reform Jewish movement, the largest segment of American Jewry, to the US Congress and administration. During the second term of the Obama administration, Rabbi Saperstein served as the US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, carrying out his responsibilities as the country's chief diplomat on religious freedom issues. And last but not least, Adina Vogel-Ayalon, Chief of Staff for J Street, Israel. Adina has extensive experience in developing and initiating Israeli-Palestinian people-to-people peace-building programs. We'll now start the discussion, but first, here is our frame. Liberal and progressive voices in the Jewish community are seemingly in the best position to challenge the Jewish-Israeli erasure in the progressive discourse. The great challenge in harnessing progressive Jewish organizations in the struggle against Jewish-Israeli erasure is the perception among many that it might enable Israel to evade discussion on Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. What are the prospects of Israel engagement among progressive groups? Is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really an impassible barrier? What are the prospects of Jewish progressive groups to lead the efforts to counter the Israeli Jewish erasure and to be part of broad Jewish coalitions in this regard? As mentioned before, you will each have 6 minutes to speak. I will keep a strict time policy and will notify you 1 minute before your time is up. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be with you. And it's nice seeing some old friends and meeting some new people on the panel as well. Sometimes, as we all know, it's impossible to have rational discussions about Israel, Palestine, in progressive spaces and other places, but there are ways to do it. And I wanted to share with you one story which I found very instructive, not only for what it was, and you'll hear that in a second, but also its implications for the campus and other places as well. Those of you who are familiar with anti-Semitism in the United States may remember the Aryan Nations, which was a neo-Nazi organization near Spokane, Washington, in Idaho, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It was responsible for assassinating a Jewish talk show host named Alan Berg. It was responsible for bombings. We all know what happened in Pittsburgh in 1999, though. There was an Aryan Nations member who shot up the JCC in Los Angeles, injuring 3 children. There was a priest who spoke out in the community there, and he had his house firebombed for it. So it was a real source of domestic terrorism and sort of ground zero for far-right anti-Semitism until it got shut down in 2001. But there's still in that area a large white supremacist presence. There was a Martin Luther King Day parade where somebody put a backpack with fishing weights and a bomb that didn't go off. Kids were in that march. I mean, you can imagine the terror that would have happened. But in that community, there was a problem because even though the center was shut down, as I was saying, there was still a lot of activity. And the way it got shut down was not just by the lawsuit, it was by the organizing by progressives and the Jewish community in that area. And I know those folks because I helped set up a center for hate studies. And I got a call a few years ago from some of the peace and justice folks who were involved in the pushback against the white supremacy and saying the Jewish community is refusing to talk to them. They're calling them anti-Semites. They're not even in the same room. Why? Because this peace and justice group had a static page that was pro-BDS on its website. And this, they got to realize, was nuts because nobody was going to impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there were still domestic terrorists who were targeting progressives and Jews and others in the community. So what do they do about it? Decided that they needed to get together and figure out a vocabulary to speak across distances. So people were specifically invited. I gave them 80 pages of text. It was an all-day thing. They had to be respectful and honest about what they thought. They had to read the curriculum. And what I did is I started out with things from hate studies so people could think about what happens to their identity when it's wrapped in an issue of perceived social justice and injustice. And I went through with them why we crave black and white, why we crave terms. I went through brain science. I went through evolutionary psychology. I went through social psychology. I mean, you could even take a group like this, if we're watching this, divide it into 2 different groups. After each group forms an identity, even though everybody knows it's entirely arbitrary and random, we all like our group better. We all think we're smarter. We all think we're more attractive. That's just how human beings are wired, to see an us and a them. Then with that background, reading a lot of that material, then we started talking about anti-Semitism and the history of anti-Semitism. And it wasn't until the afternoon that we got into the Israeli-Palestinian question. 3 years later, these folks are still talking. They have differences. But what they learned from this, from being able to look at the complexities as opposed to trying to reduce this to simple black and white, good and bad, it was stark. I'll give you 2 things. One person who was the Peace and Justice Group said, now that I understand the history of anti-Semitism, I understand why Jews feel so upset when people are talking about boycotting, giving the historic example of Jews being boycotted. And there was somebody who was actually from the community there, from the Jewish community, who was an AIPAC member, who said, I'm taking your point that I described when I was debating a Palestinian academic about BDS. The Palestinian guys said, well, look, people like me were saying back at the time of the Second Intifada, let's find something that's nonviolent to do. BDS, whatever you want to say about it, is nonviolent. So some of this, when people have a desire to speak about it on the campus, we've done programs where people are not going to change minds necessarily, but get people to have a conversation and see with emotional empathy, another narrative and another perspective. There are courses on anti-Semitism that allow you by the—
Yes, you have 1 minute left, sorry.
No, that's fine. to look at the complexities of the issue and to have much more in-depth understanding of it. There's a course on the using the Peel Commission as a simulation so that people can almost be dumped back into history and to really understand the differences. And I think that's, you know, incredibly important. One thing I would say, and I'll close on this about the discussions I've heard today, is one thing that would be useful for people who are thinking about how to think about this space. Imagine if you were a Palestinian who was displaced, for whom Zionism is part of their national disaster. People who may not be anti-Semitic at all because they don't have anything against Jews, they just see this as a misfortune for them. How would they think about this, and how do you get those people to be in a conversation to think more broadly about these issues? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. Nomi, the floor is all yours now.
Toda Avital and toda to Reut for hosting this conference. I just want to put on my timer here, and for engaging us in this conversation. As is often the case, the only problem is that there are too many good sessions running simultaneously. So the benefit of Zoom is that we can all go back and watch the others. Before I even answer what Amenu is and what we do and how we're trying to engage Jewish and non-Jewish groups on Israel, I want to say something about the bigger question of the erasure in progressive discourse. While I admit that working in progressive circles is getting more difficult and that there has been increasing in an anti-left sentiment and anti-Jewish sentiment from both left and right, and at another time, I look forward to discussing what was discussed in that first plenary of why it's difficult for us as a community to unite on this fight. I think that the Jewish-Israeli erasure is still a gross generalization, but not for the same reasons that Batya discussed in the opening plenary. Moreover, examining this issue through this binary framework does not help us achieve our goals. And we need to continue our work and teach others that not all progressives are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, that we can be both. And it is our job to illustrate how this is possible. So Amenu, this national multi-generational community of progressive Jews here in the United States with other chapters in Canada, Australia, and Israel, works on a wide progressive slate. Two-state solution, ending the occupation, social justice and protection of democratic rights for all Israeli citizens, religious and cultural pluralism, gender equity, full legal and social equality for LGBTQ, dignity for refugees, environmental sustainability. We work on all of these issues. And this is an advantage for us because we support a progressive agenda independently and with other organizations and alliances with other progressive umbrella organizations to promote our shared goals. So we can work with one organization on one issue and another with another, but we continue to strengthen these bonds between our groups to understand we work. We work with the Progressive Israel Network, with J-Link, and we also sit on a Conference of Presidents and the American Zionist Movement, which actually puts us in a way that we are both with the left and the right working together for larger coalitions. So now what do we do? And exactly when I talked about why we don't want to be talking binary is Amenu's most important endeavor, which is called the third narrative. The third narrative was an initiative started in 2003 to provide progressive answers to the far left criticism against Israel while developing these constructive alliances with progressive activists. And we've had a pamphlet that's been distributed in 22 countries to synagogues, mosques, churches, college campuses, unions, Israel advocacy groups, and it's been requested by congressional staffers, the British Board of Deputies, and even the Israeli Prime Minister's office. And we explain that, of course, as we all know in this conversation, you can criticize Israeli policies and behavior, but that you must separate these legitimate, productive criticisms from these polemical, inaccurate, and unfair attacks. And we try and appeal to those that we work with on these human rights and social justice issues and give them the answers that they need in where we all work, which is really in these gray areas. Functioning under the third narrative is also the Alliance for Academic Freedom, which is a network of over 200 academics and scholars, which I'm so proud to say that Ken is an active participant. And this organization is also working on college campuses, where they're working on issues of academic freedom and open intellectual exchange, and they're rejecting calls for academic boycotts and blacklists, as well as efforts to punish academics for political speeches, including those who support the academic boycotts we oppose. They too have been successful in defeating several such proposals by enlisting others to work within organizations with shared principles and to make some changes there. Over 10 years ago, I worked with my local CRC to dissuade the Presbyterian Church to boycott and divest from Israel. And alas, we know that this issue continues to come up in our social justice circles. The Presbyterians from Middle East is a group within the Presbyterian Church that supports a two-state solution and opposes BDS. They've approached Imenu for support at a church conference, and they put forth a proposal that called for reconciliation, not retribution, in this, which we see as an anti-Israeli bias. And we have brought in other partners, such as Project Rosanna, that builds and works on bridges between Israelis and Palestinians that work through healthcare, something that the Presbyterian Church is very interested in. We distribute materials to speak to delegates, and the divestment proposal still did not pass.
Naomi, you have 1 minute left, sorry.
We also continue this work with unions. Last year, there was a proposal on boycotting at the National Education Association, and we played a central role in the Jewish communal involvement in getting this resolution tabled. And through our continued roundtables and umbrella organizations, we strive to forge alliances where people can understand that there's another way to look at this so that people can coexist, and that hopefully we can be creating Israel and Palestinians to work together and to thrive together. In my last 30 seconds, I just also want to say that I reject Batya's point from earlier about that it's undignified for us to reach out to other people that work in some of these organizations. We know, yes, that there may be a small group in some of these progressive organizations that are working on this issue. And by talking with them, bringing them materials and seeing that this does not have to be part of their large policy at every convention, that strengthens our relationships and shows that it's not that we are anti-Palestinian, it's that we don't want them to be anti-Israel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for this very inspiring talk. Now moving on to Jonathan Kessler. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Avital, and thank you, Ken and Naomi, for your remarks. Very much looking forward to hearing from Adina and David. I've known Adina since I was a younger guy, and David since I was a much, much younger guy. Listening to the discussion so far, there are those who say that when it comes to progressives, you got to beat them. And there are those who say when it comes to progressives, you got to join them. The problem is a lot of us are them. We are Democrats, we are progressives, we are part of a community that leans very much into the progressive space. And our children are very much identified and identifying progressively. So when it comes to a conversation like this, definitions are important, but distinctions and differentiations are absolutely imperative. To say that all progressives hate us and then to repeat it several times, or to suggest that all progressives think the same really boggles the mind. There are so many distinctions in the space we would call the left, but the most important for our conversation seems to me to be those who oppose Israel for what it does and those who oppose Israel for what it is. And from my own experience, the number of self-identifying progressives who oppose things that Israel does is so much more expansive than the extraordinarily small number of radicals who literally oppose the way Israel defines itself. A year ago, 50 Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans came together to launch Heart of a Nation. And Heart of a Nation is bringing together a community of purpose made up of progressives from all three societies that are looking to better, not batter, the nations they love. Now, I am the first to admit that the progressives Heart of a Nation is working with are not looking to burnish Israel's image. They are not looking to make supporters of Israel more comfortable, nor are they trying their hardest to make us like them. And finally, they're not particularly bothered by our approbation, if you will. But in my 40 years of working with progressives, there are two things that I have concluded. Two immutable truths. First, American progressives will never accept in Israel what they can't accept in America. It is an immutable truth. And second, that dissatisfaction with the way things are in America, in Israel, in Palestine, and across the globe is a hallmark of progressive thinking. American progressive thinking, Israeli progressive thinking, and Palestinian progressive thinking. In the past year, we have identified and engaged an enormous number of American progressives who are excited about the notion of bettering, not battering, the nations they love. And to the point of this convening, when people come together to solve problems that afflict each of their societies, they are far less inclined to beat each other up. We have seen a tremendous surge of what we call bridging and bonding social capital among Palestinians, Israelis, and Americans who are forward-facing. And remember, we launched a year ago, just before the horrific events of May. We got through that. We've gotten through a lot of challenges since, and the community has expanded and gotten much, much stronger. We've recently launched a teen essay competition for progressive teenagers from Palestine, Israel, and the United States to reflect on what they most want to improve about their own societies. This essay competition is now being sponsored by the Christian Science Monitor, Al-Quds, the largest Palestinian daily, and Jerusalem Post. These are three publications that have never, ever worked together and are excited to work with the 15 teens, 5 from each society, who have literally launched this new initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this very thought-provoking words. Rabbi Saperstein, moving on to you.
Okay, first, I deeply appreciate everything that we've heard, and I look forward to the next presentation as well. Like others, I see this as a very serious challenge, but not nearly as pervasive as too many voices in the Jewish community make it out to be. If you ask our synagogues, who are deeply involved in progressive coalitions at the local level, how often efforts at erasure come up, they would tell you virtually never. And if you look at those of us who work on Capitol Hill with the Progressive Caucus and in broad progressive coalitions here in Washington, D.C., the number of times this comes up is very, very rare. Second point, the time to deal with this is not at times of crisis. It is building relationships at times that there's not a crisis in the Middle East. Very often the groups that we work with actually don't understand what is and it's not anti-Semitic, and the time to do the education is not at moments of crisis. Often they don't understand when someone in their organization said something that is anti-Semitic, why it's a big deal and what to do about it. And the time to prepare for that is not at times of crisis in the Middle East. And when at times of crisis, we hope to get their support getting them prepared in advance is the crucial time to do that. A lot of the groups, when something like Sunrise happened, a lot of the groups we spoke to, I mean, timing is everything. It happened just as we were running into a weekend. When we spoke to a lot of groups afterwards and said, why didn't you speak out? They said, we never heard of Sunrise here. We had no idea that this was a big deal to you. If we had known, we certainly would have done it, but we don't never hear that in our own organization. So we just didn't think it was a big deal to do. The time to deal with those situations is not at a moment of crisis, but to get ready for moments of crisis. So when we called to say, this is what we discussed and we need you to speak out, they're already prepared for that. There are efforts underway in different places to actually engage in this. A lot of us are doing it episodically. We heard from Amenu, the work that they do when certain issues arise, but a lot of us are trying to do this at times when there aren't crises going on, but we don't really have an entity devoted to that kind of education in the US. There is in the UK an entity that a former RAC legislative assistant developed a group. We have the Litakein seminar, as many of you know about, for 2,000 high school and college students every year at the RAC. She calls this project Litakein in the UK as well, and it targets progressive groups, cultural groups, political groups, groups who are progressive policy groups, academic groups, to work with them in advance. An 8-hour program. Insist that senior people of the organization be part of this program to help them understand the history of anti-Semitism, the kind of thing Ken talked about before, the history of anti-Semitism, what to be sensitive about, what to try to avoid, how to respond when something happens, etc. We could use a group like that here in the US as well. So the other point I would make, which I've made before at Reud, is when we define in too broad terms what is and is not anti-Semitism, when in the Jewish community they always would say every form of BDS, including boycott of settlement products and things like that, is inherently anti-Semitic. Any reference to apartheid, including warnings that Israel's moving in a direction on the West Bank to apartheid situation, and if it doesn't reverse, it will end up there. The kind of thing that Ben Gurion and Rabin and Olmert have said, that anyone who says anything about that is anti-Semitic. You're writing off large numbers of people who will be with us on the core issue. That is efforts to delegitimize the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state in their historic homeland. That effort at delegitimizing that right is really the forms of BDS, of apartheid, of anti-Zionism that we have to address. But when we define those things too broadly, it is a serious division in the broader coalition that will stand together against real anti-Semitism here. I urge people to take a look at the San Francisco consensus paper that the CRCA out there did. It was a wonderful effort, engaging all the stakeholders, coming up with very wise policies. We need more of that in the Jewish community as well. We shouldn't be locked into any one definition about this. So much depends on context. I like that paper because it was sensitive to contextual issues here. The fundamental rule of coalitional community relations politics, in order to have a friend, you got to be a friend, is needed more than ever in terms of our work in the progressive community.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Saperstein, for these very insightful and important distinctions. And now, last but not least, like in the presentation, Adina, you're our final speaker. Floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Avital. And of course, thank you to the other distinguished panelists. I do believe that some of what we will all be saying it might be repetitive. It's nice to see this group in agreement on a lot of these issues. So of course, I also want to thank the Reud Institute for this opportunity. And I, like Rabbi Saperstein, wanted to focus my remarks on how we engage progressives and liberals on an ongoing basis and not only during peaks of escalation or in conflict. And for me, this starts with labeling, which is a common theme of today's conference. Labeling progressives as anti-Semites is actually not only unhelpful, but it is harmful to the discourse around Israel. And at J Street, an American pro-Israel advocacy organization, we do not dismiss the very real threat of anti-Semitism. And of course, the last few years have seen a shocking rise in increasingly open and all too often deadly anti-Semitism, compared also to a similar rise in xenophobia, ethno-nationalism, and hate-based attacks. Historically, anti-Semitism rooted in ethno-nationalism and xenophobia has been the greatest threat to Jews' safety, both in the United States and around the world, and this continues to be the case today. It's also true that in recent years, Jewish people have experienced an increasing rate of anti-Semitic incidents associated with antipathy towards Israel and Zionism, leaving many people feeling attacked from all sides. And there's a lot of work that we have to do to build solidarity and awareness in order to fight the forces of division and confront the prejudice of anti-Semitism. But there are also those that conflate Jewish identity and the support of actions of the Israeli government with the systemic injustice against Palestinians. And of course, these forces ignore the extremely wide and diverse range of views held by diaspora Jews and by Israelis themselves. And today there are many that seek to blur that line between Jewishness and Israel, including by those who seek to classify fair criticism of the Israeli government as a form of anti-Semitism. And the organized Jewish and pro-Israel community is quick to label critique of Israeli policies as anti-Semitism, which, like I said, is not only helpful, but it also polarizes the American Jewish community and liberal and progressive constituencies on Israel. They are quick to leap to this label of anti-Semitism without actually addressing the substance of the issues at hand or criticism. And Amnesty International's report was noted in the opening plenary, and I want to refer to that that report as a case study of where the organized pro-Israel community actually failed specifically on this issue. As firmly pro-Israel organization that operates within the progressive and liberal space in the United States, we did not endorse the conclusions of the report, and nor do we use the word apartheid to describe the situation on the ground. We also acknowledge the lack of context and history in formulating what we felt were problematic conclusions in that report. But that being said, there were substantive issues that were raised that we cannot dismiss, and nor should the entire pro-Israel community, which was incredibly quick to label Amnesty as an anti-Semitic organization without dealing with any of the substance of that report. So what we would do is urge Israel and its friends around the world not to use the issues with the report as an excuse to avoid grappling with the day in and day out realities of the occupation and the moral and strategic catastrophe that it represents for Israelis and for Palestinians. Using these false claims of anti-Semitism against anti-occupation and human rights activists and experts do a further disservice to the critical fight against the very real threat of anti-Semitism today. And I want to note in this forum to all of you that are present in more conservative spaces that deal with the issue of Israel, that you can work to ensure that legitimate opposition to Israeli government policies and support for the rights of Palestinians is not conflated with anti-Semitism, and that we can recognize the separation between Jewish identity and the Israeli government by being clear that Jews and Palestinians and people must have the right to freely criticize the actions of Israeli government in good faith without being smeared as anti-Semitic or facing disingenuous attacks. Attacking individuals as anti-Semitic for expressing genuinely held critiques of Israeli government undermines the fight against anti-Semitism and has too often been used to exclude diverse voices and shut down important discussions about Palestinians' rights. And for those of us that operate in progressive spaces, we can also acknowledge that unfortunately some individuals take critique of the Israeli state and government as a license to justify anti-Semitism. And we must work together to ensure that Jewish individuals and Jews collectively are not going to be vilified for actions of the Israeli government based on our Jewish identity. And we are stronger working together to build broad coalitions in a movement that fights for the struggle of justice and equality and peace. There is polarization on the issue of Israel in the United States and throughout the Jewish community, but many in the organized Jewish community don't see how they contribute to that polarization by labeling all of those with critical views as anti-Semites. So we at J Street, as we engage our constituencies of American Jews, members of Congress, policymakers, we continue to highlight the fact that you can be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. We reject the blanket stereotypes and give our movement the language to talk about this in a way that doesn't isolate and mislabel people that we should actually be engaging. This conference began with opening remarks that labeled progressives as a problem and is holding one unified identity that is inherently anti-Zionist, and this to me is creating the problem. The comments of one member of Congress were lifted up in the opening plenary, a member of Congress that actually supports a two-state solution. That member of Congress's remarks were lifted up as anti-Semitic, while at the same time, anti-Semitic tropes and remarks by our former president of the United States are almost never rebuked by the organized Jewish and pro-Israel community.
Less than 1 minute, sorry.
So I just was, in order to engage progressive and liberal constituents on Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we need to ask ourselves, how do we disagree with those that criticize the policy of State of Israel without labeling and dismissing them as anti-Semites? We understand that nuance might not always be appealing to those that are seeking to polarize the debate, but we have to truly operate in service of what is best for the pro-Israel community and learn when and how to engage, where to draw the line, and when labeling is destructive and unhelpful to the cause of working to provide a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Thank you, Adina. This has been, we need to pull up our sleeves because there's a lot of work to be done, which is a good thing. Now we have very last few minutes. Thank you all for our speakers. Just one quick note and then one quick question that we have here from one of our viewers. The quick note is, for anyone who's watching or listening, Rabbi Saperstein mentioned a project in the UK called Letaken, and it can be found on the website oive.co.uk, and you can find it on the chat below if you want to refer to that. And now we have a question, and I'm putting it out there for any one of you who would like to address it. And the question is, what kind of strategizing is going on in the organized Jewish American community to counter the serious challenge posed by such groups as JVP, if not now, who seek to weaken American Jewish support for Israel by dividing the community and also protect anti-Zionists against legitimate charges of anti-Semitism? This is a big question. Adina, do you want to try and, Naomi.
So I'll take the first shot. I mean, I think that each of us would probably speak 12 minutes on this question alone. This is a lot of work that we do.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna, and I think you actually got some of the answers of what needs to be done. So answering it upside down from what I said and what we all said on this panel, and this is this. As a man who sits on the Conference of Presidents and sits on the AZM, I'm a vice president of AZM, for example, but that doesn't mean that I am not also called an anti-Zionist in print often, and many of us are. And what we keep saying is, by doing this, hey, central Jews that are in the center, listen to what we're saying, because as David said earlier, when you group us all together, and when Adina says, when you call us these issues, then you're not understanding the differentiation, and you're not understanding where the Jewish community has been moving. And one of the reasons I would submit, and I say this a lot when I speak about college students and teens, is that when they hear things and they come from progressive households, and then they come back and sit at the Shabbat table and ask their parents and grandparents about things that they've heard about Israel, and they're not allowed to discuss it, and they're just constantly dismissed by those questions. It is those kids, those youth, that next generation that continues to move into these circles because they're looking for answers, and those answers aren't being given. And the minute that we in the Jewish community can come together and accept that, just like there are always disagreements among Jews, that there are disagreements on how we see Israel, on how we are all Zionists, that we are also Zionist, that the Zionist is not a word that's controlled by the right. I say on Emmanuel, coming from the labor background you talked about as well, that the Zionists that created the state, the labor Zionists that this work. So we need them to hear what these kids are saying and to be able to give them answers and to show that there is a way, and that we also agree that Israel needs to change some of its policies, lots of its policies, and accept that it is okay for Jews to be critical of Israel. And when we do that, that I believe will also be a way that we will be saying to these communities, hey, you all don't need to go there because we're here too. We're in the community. So let's work together. Let's strengthen that alliance. Let's say that we can understand that we can all be Zionists because really we all want the same goal.
This is such a strong message, and I'm actually very happy that we picked this question, although it was a very big question, because I think you've answered it beautifully in a very inspiring manner. We actually just ran out of time. We were exactly on point. Nomi, Adina, Jonathan, Ken, Rabbi Saperstein, thank you so much for your participation, for taking the time and for sharing your insights with us. For all our viewers and listeners, I hope you took some of it with you, and I invite you all to exit back to the lobby and then join our panel before the last gathering. So thank you all very, very much. I've enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.